Right now in NASCAR, there's a very real sense that something significant is about to shift, and you can feel it every single weekend in the garage. Today, we are covering two major developments surrounding one of the most iconic names this sport has ever produced. And when you put these two stories together, they start painting a picture that honestly nobody wanted to see this early. This is not just about one bad race or one difficult afternoon. This is about a much deeper situation involving health concerns, contract pressure, team chemistry breaking down, and serious questions about the long-term future of a driver who helped define an entire generation of NASCAR racing. The tension is building every week. The radio communications sound heavier. The reactions feel more loaded. And fans across the sport are now asking questions that very few people expected to be asking at this point in Kyle Busch's career. Let's start with what happened at Watkins Glen, because that moment caught the entire NASCAR world off guard almost immediately. Kyle Busch was actually putting together one of his strongest performances of the entire season. He was running inside the top 5 late in the race. The car had genuine pace, the strategy was holding together, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, the number 8 team genuinely looked like they had a real shot at competing for something meaningful rather than just fighting to survive another frustrating week. Then, during the final stage, Kyle Busch came over the radio with a very unusual and unexpected request. He calmly asked his team to track down Dr. William Heisel after the race and told them he was going to need a medical shot. That message immediately got attention throughout the garage. Veteran NASCAR journalist Dustin Long was the first to report the radio communication, noting that Busch specifically asked for Dr. Heisel to meet him at the team bus after the race rather than at the car itself. What made the moment feel even more significant was the tone in Busch's voice. He was completely calm, very direct, and entirely serious. There was no panic, no emergency urgency, just a quiet and deliberate request that told you something was genuinely wrong. The FS1 broadcast later helped provide some important context around the situation by reporting that Kyle Busch had apparently been dealing with a sinus illness throughout the entire week leading into Watkins. So, from everything that has been reported, this does not appear to be connected to any crash injury or any dangerous physical situation inside the race car, and that is obviously a relief. But even with that clarification fully on the table, the moment still felt deeply symbolic of just how exhausting and draining this entire season has become for Kyle Busch and for Richard Childress Racing as an organization. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, this has been genuinely painful to watch if you have been a long-time Kyle Busch supporter. We are talking about a 2-time Cup Series champion, one of the most naturally gifted racers NASCAR has ever seen, a driver who spent the better part of 2 decades being one of the most feared and respected competitors in the entire paddock. And yet, for the past 2 seasons, it feels like nearly every single weekend produces another chapter in a story about frustration, disappointment, missed opportunities, radio arguments, and performances that fall well short of what everyone expected in this partnership. What made Watkins Glen stand out even more sharply was the specific timing of everything. For the first time in a long while, Kyle Busch was delivering a race that genuinely looked like the version of him that fans remember from his dominant years. The speed was real. The execution was holding together. The car was doing what it needed to do, and fans were cautiously beginning to allow themselves to feel some genuine optimism. Then the conversation suddenly shifted from a potential momentum-building performance to medical attention being required after the checkered flag, and that created a wave of concern and unease that spread quickly across the NASCAR fan base. But things got considerably heavier when people started connecting the Watkins Glen moment to the already growing tension surrounding Busch's future at Richard Childress. Because just 1 week earlier at Texas, Kyle Busch was already drawing significant scrutiny following his on-track incident with John Hunter Nemechek on the white flag lap. Busch got aggressive and physical in his battle with Nemechek during the closing moments of the race, and the resulting contact ended up costing both drivers heavily in the final finishing order. That incident opened the door for Kevin Harvick to step forward with comments that honestly surprised a significant portion of the NASCAR community. Speaking on his show Speed with Harvick and Buxton, Harvick essentially suggested that Kyle Busch may be running out of viable options in the Cup Series if his current trajectory continues. Consider how striking that statement actually is for a moment. We're talking about a future Hall of Famer, one of the most accomplished drivers in the modern history of this sport. And there are now serious and credible conversations happening about whether his long-term place in NASCAR's Premier Series is genuinely uncertain. Harvick specifically stated his belief that the number 8 car at Richard Childress Racing may realistically represent Busch's only meaningful opportunity going forward. And he went as far as saying that even if it is not the only option available, it is almost certainly the best one. You could clearly tell that even while Buxton was caught off guard by how direct and unfiltered Harvick was willing to be on that subject publicly. When you honestly examined the current landscape of the Cup Series, Harvick's uncomfortable assessment starts making a difficult kind of sense. The majority of top-tier organizations already have young and talented drivers locked into long-term contracts. Teams across the board are making significant investments in younger prospects with development trajectories ahead of them. Sponsor relationships are increasingly built around the promise of long-term stability and brand alignment with rising stars. Development programs at the elite level are stronger and more competitive than they have ever been before. And in the middle of all that, Kyle Busch finds himself at 41 years old, navigating a complicated contract situation and enduring what has become one of the most difficult stretches of his professional career. That is exactly where the second major story begins, connecting directly to everything we have just been discussing. Because according to multiple credible reports and conversations happening around the garage, the frustration building between Kyle Busch and Richard Childress Racing may genuinely be approaching a critical internal breaking point. And if you have been listening carefully to the team radio communications throughout this season, you can already sense the shift without anyone having to tell you directly. There have been visibly heated moments at Martinsville. There has been obvious and sustained frustration during multiple races. There have been sharp radio exchanges, ongoing disappointment over car speed, issues with setups, strategic miscommunications, and a general sense that the overall program is simply not performing at anywhere near the level either side hoped and expected when this deal. Emotional outbursts and radio frustration are certainly nothing new when it comes to Kyle Busch. His entire career has included moments of visible passion and high emotion, and fans have come to understand that as part of who he is as a competitor. The difference now is that during his peak years at Joe Gibbs Racing, those intense radio moments almost always existed within a context of wins, deep playoff runs, and championship-level performance. The fire had a destination. Now, the frustration keeps accumulating week after week, but the wins and trophies are not following, and that fundamental change in context shifts how every single person inside the garage perceives and reacts to them. According to sources with knowledge of the internal situation, the tension has been building on both sides of this relationship simultaneously. Kyle Busch is reportedly becoming increasingly frustrated with the organization's consistent inability to put him in a position to compete at the very front of the field where he expects to be racing. At the same time, there are reportedly people inside Richard Childress Racing who are growing genuinely exhausted by the weight of the constant negativity and the emotional pressure that surrounds the entire program on a weekly basis. That combination is a genuinely dangerous one for any professional racing team, because once frustration stops being purely competitive and starts becoming personal, situations have a tendency to deteriorate very quickly and very publicly. Layer on top of all of that the doctor request at Watkins Glen, the ongoing illness concerns, the weight of 2 full seasons of emotional exhaustion, the contract uncertainty hanging over everything, and it becomes understandable why people inside NASCAR are beginning to wonder whether the situation has grown into something more complex than simply a difficult season. Some voices around the sport are quietly starting to ask whether Kyle Busch is gradually and painfully losing the competitive edge and relentless drive that made him such a genuinely terrifying force for so many years at the highest level of this sport. Writing Kyle Busch off entirely would still be a significant mistake, and it is important to say that clearly. This is still one of the most intelligent and strategically aware racers in the entire garage, one of the toughest and most resilient competitors NASCAR has ever developed, and the history of this sport includes plenty of veteran drivers who found ways to bounce back powerfully after people counted them out and moved on. But at the same time, you cannot honestly look away from the reality sitting right in front of you. The consistent results have not been there. The pressure keeps intensifying with every passing week, and the overall energy surrounding this entire situation feels meaningfully different now compared to even just 1 year ago. That is precisely why the coming months are going to be absolutely critical, not just for Kyle Busch personally, but for Richard Childress Racing as an organization and for the broader NASCAR silly season storylines that are already beginning to take shape. If this partnership cannot find a way to stabilize and start producing real results soon, the questions surrounding Busch's future in the sport are only going to grow louder and more pointed with each passing race. And for the fans who have followed this sport through everything, that is genuinely emotional territory to navigate. We're talking about a driver who defined an era, a personality who made every single Sunday feel bigger, whether you were cheering for him or desperately hoping he would. Kyle Busch has been one of the most powerful and polarizing forces in modern NASCAR for nearly 20 years. And watching him go through a struggle of this magnitude is something that a lot of fans are finding genuinely difficult to process and accept.